The annual Harborview City Charity Gala had a way of dressing its claws in velvet. Underneath the chandeliers and the tinkling of crystal, power struggles hummed like a current beneath the marble floors. Nora Hale had learned that the hard way. For 3 years, she floated through this shimmering battlefield as the executive assistant to Victor Lang, a man whose ego was embarrassingly outsized, even by the standards of billionaires. He liked to joke that his signature could move the stock market. What he never joked about was that he expected everyone around him, especially Nora, to be grateful for his orbit. Her role was to be invisible and indispensable. Tonight that meant weaving through caterers, memorizing the names of investors' wives, fetching Victor's champagne before he remembered he wanted it, and letting out soft, well-timed laughs at his clumsy jokes that weren't really jokes at all. In a simple navy dress that hugged and hid in equal measure, Nora stood a few feet behind him, the perfect phantom. Victor held court with a circle of slick suits and colder smiles, basking under the warm glow of attention as if the lights were hung for him alone. "And that's when I told my assistant Nora," Victor boomed, jabbing a finger somewhere behind him in her general direction without so much as glancing back. "If she couldn't secure me a tea time at the club, what exactly was I paying her for?" He let out a harsh, braying laugh, and the men around him echoed it, some with genuine amusement, most because they weren't sure what else to do. Heat flared up Nora's neck, pooling in her cheeks. The humiliation was sharp and familiar, like stepping on the same broken shard of glass you thought you'd swept away long ago. Victor loved using her as a punchline, another accessory in a collection of things that proved his importance. He would diminish someone else, and in that collapse, he grew. Nora kept her expression smooth and unbothered, the mask she wore like a second skin. She needed the paycheck, needed the insurance, needed the stability to keep the Hale household patched together back in Cedar Ridge. Her mother's rising medical bills didn't care about Nora's pride. "Excuse me, Victor," one of the investors said abruptly, looking past Victor's shoulder, "but I'm pretty sure Cassian Vale is headed our way." The air shifted the way it does right before a storm. Conversations nearby softened, heads turned. If Victor Lang was a king in his own fading legend, then Cassian Vale was the meteor that made kings obsolete. The CEO of Vale Dynamics walked like he could bend steel with a decision. He was the kind of myth whispered in universities and war rooms, calculated, lethal, impossible to intimidate. Even across the room, Nora felt the focus of him like a change in air pressure. Dark eyes, controlled movements, an aura that suggested the ground tilted to accommodate him. He had the kind of face people remembered and the kind of presence they wished they didn't. Victor straightened his tie and rolled his shoulders back, his smirk deflating to a careful smile. "Cassian, good to see you." Cassian gave Victor a brief nod, his gaze rinsing over the group as if measuring their usefulness, then landing on Nora. The focus pinned her to the spot. For a fraction of a heartbeat, she was very sure she was the only person in the ballroom. Victor, scenting an opportunity to polish himself against someone brighter, turned to her. "Nora, be a dear and fetch Mr. Vale his preferred whiskey. Surely you can manage that, can't you?" It was a simple instruction, a petty little leash tug meant to remind her she was, in his world, staff. The small circle leaned slightly forward, waiting for her to step back into her role of service. Before Nora could answer, Cassian moved one step closer. "That won't be necessary, Victor," Cassian said, his voice a low, clean cut through the noise. He still didn't look away from Nora. "I was actually coming over to steal your assistant for a dance." Silence swept over the investors like a hush in a cathedral. Victor's mouth dropped open in a graceless way he'd never seen in a mirror. Cassian extended his hand, the challenge in his eyes not unkind but undeniable. It felt like a rope tossed to someone standing in tidewater, watching the sea swallow their ankles. Nora didn't hesitate. She placed her hand in his. His palm was warm, steady. "If you'll excuse us," Cassian said, not a question in sight, and he led her away from Victor's orbit, through the wash of whispers, out toward the dance floor. Victor was left staring after them, A man suddenly unsure whether he'd just been insulted or outmaneuvered, maybe both. As Cassian drew her close, Nora caught the scent of his cologne, cedar, something clean and expensive, and underneath it, something she recognized but couldn't place. A contradiction she would later realize was vulnerability. The string quartet swelled, and the crowd accommodated him without realizing it. He began to move. He was an exceptional dancer, firm without force, guiding her through turns as if he'd anticipated each step before she did. "Thank you," Nora said quietly, her voice laced with nerves and something else, relief. "You didn't have to do that." "Victor Lang is a peacock," Cassian murmured, his lips near her ear so that the words tickled a part of her that had nothing to do with sound. "Every so often it's healthy for a peacock to realize the feathers aren't armor." He turned her elegantly, his hand a confident warmth against her back. "He doesn't appreciate you." "That's a mistake." "Appreciate me?" She almost laughed, breathless with the ridiculousness and the sweetness of it both at once. "I fetch coffee and schedules, and prevent disasters and babysit egos," he countered easily. "An asset like you should be held in very high regard." The word asset should have felt clinical, but the way he said it wrapped it in respect instead of ownership. For the rest of the night, Cassian treated her as if she were the headliner, not the backup vocalist. He introduced her to people whose names made headlines and whose donations moved mountains. "This is Nora Hale. She has a vantage point most executives would kill for," he said to a hedge fund founder whose soft smile sharpened with interest. Cassian brought her flutes of cool champagne and asked her questions that weren't just scripted courtesies. He listened as if the room weren't filled with people hungry for his attention. It was intoxicating, attention without the price. For the first time in a long while, Nora felt visible, and visibility didn't feel like exposure, it felt like sunlight. As the night thinned and the ballroom loosened its glittering grip on its guests, Cassian guided Nora to a terrace washed in silver. Harbor view spilled out below them, bridges like crown jewels, water black as lacquer. "Nora," he said, and his voice had flattened into something serious, without the practiced charm that men like him wore like tailored suits. "I wasn't just ruffling Victor's feathers." "No?" She leaned against the cool stone banister, the night air fresh against the heat of her skin. "I was making an assessment," he said simply, "and I'm right." "You're wasted on him." He stepped closer, that aura of command easing the way someone might slip into a seat they've claimed 100 times. "I'm going to make you a proposal. It's unconventional, but we both know most worthwhile things are." She arched a brow. "You could buy a fleet of yachts. You don't seem like a man who needs unconventional." "Needs?" His mouth tipped, almost a smile. "No, but I know leverage when I see it." He exhaled, steady. "My board wants a stabilized public image. They want to see that I'm settled. They want a fiancé on my arm, a partner for social events. 6 months, appearances only. In return, I give you an exit ramp, out from Victor, out from your current circumstances." His gaze held her unflinching. "A way out for your family." Her breath snagged. "My family? I do my homework." He didn't flinch, and there was no cruelty in his admission, only fact. "Your mother's treatment, your mortgage, your father's pension dispute with a certain corporation. The water rises fast. Alone, you'll keep treading. With me, you don't have to." The air felt thinner. He was offering her the thing she barely allowed herself to pray for. He was also admitting that he knew her softest spots. "What exactly are you asking in return?" "Your loyalty," Cassian said, not missing a beat. "Your presence beside me in public. Total discretion, and," his voice lightened, smooth as silk, "maybe some casual conversation about your old job. Your vantage point intrigues me. Lang Global has always been a hobby of mine." He said it so casually, it almost drifted away on the night breeze. Almost. But Nora heard it, like a faint note beneath a melody, She was desperate and she was dazzled, and yet somewhere under her ribs a tiny red light flickered. "You make it sound like business, isn't everything?" He tilted his head, the city painting his cheekbones with silver and shadow. "I can settle your family's debts. There would be a stipend, a private driver, a wardrobe, everything you need to inhabit this role convincingly. And I'll make sure you never fetch tea for a man like Victor again." Nora stared at him. The man who had offered her more respect in one evening than Victor had offered in 3 years had just extended a lifeline. It wasn't pure, it wasn't simple, but it was a way out. Her mouth was dry. She thought of her mother's tired eyes, the stack of bills on the kitchen table, Victor's laughter pressing down on her like a thumb. "I accept," she whispered. The words felt like oxygen and surrender all at once. A slow, satisfied smile drew across Cassian's face, like someone who had nudged the first domino and heard the cascade begin. He had selected his piece. He had placed her on the board, and the game, as far as he was concerned, had just begun. She didn't realize it yet, but she was not the queen he'd draped a spotlight over all night. She was a pawn. And somewhere across the ballroom, unexpected and oddly comforting, an old woman's glass slipped from her hand and shattered. People gasped, then laughed, then forgot. Nora would remember that sound later, the small prophecy of it. Before we turn the page, a quick wave of gratitude to some of our wonderful listeners who make this community feel like more than a broadcast. Marisol from Chicago, Devin from Austin, and Keisha from San Diego. You three bring sparks to our comments and pep to our days. Thank you for being here. And you, yes, you, where are you listening from? Drop your city in the comments. Maybe next time I'll call your name too. What came next spun like a dream she couldn't sit up inside and question. A quietly efficient legal team arrived at Nora's small apartment in Cedar Ridge with a contract that read like a fairy tale printed in legalese and a cashier's check that made her mother cry in a way Nora had never seen her cry. Relief. 2 movers, who moved like ballet dancers in black t-shirts, packed the sum of Nora's life into neat boxes that seemed to swallow her history like magic. By that evening, she was standing at the threshold of Cassian Vale's penthouse in the Skycrest Tower, a glass and chrome spire that lorded over Harborview Harbor as if the water itself reported to it. The living room was vast and quiet, minimalist to the point of confession. No family photos, no messy stacks of books, no signs that someone laughed out loud within these walls. It was a place a man controlled. It was not a place he rested. "Your room is in the East Wing," Cassian said, back in his crisp, precise armor. The overnight charm had been folded and tucked away. "Mine is in the West. We maintain our own private lives, privately. Publicly, we are devoted." He handed her a tablet that felt heavier than it should have. "This includes our schedule." "Our schedule?" she asked, fighting to keep up, to keep her voice from betraying nerves. The tablet blinked awake with dozens of events, the next 6 months mapped like a battle plan. Galas, fundraisers, dinners with names that made Nora's stomach dance. "Our social calendar," he corrected with a hint of dry humor, "and a few key board meetings. I'll need you there." He paused, and something like apology flickered there and gone. "Familiarize yourself with it." That night, they ate their first dinner together on a terrace that stepped right into the sky. Air passed around them in soft currents, as if reluctant to disrupt the table set for 2. A private chef presented plates like artwork. Wine gleamed in crystal like garnet. Cassian was a different man again, curious, attentive. He asked her about the house she grew up in. Small, white, front porch with a porch swing that squeaked. About the teacher who made her fall in love with geometry. Ms. Carter with the coffee breath but the kindest eyes. About her once dream of studying architecture before job and circumstance rerouted her. He made her feel fascinating. Seen. Then, gracefully, like a dancer changing partners mid-spin, he shifted the conversation. "I've always been impressed by Victor's ability to launch things quickly," Cassian mused, swirling his wine. "He always seems a step ahead of analysis." Nora raised her glass, hiding a smile behind it. "Victor? A step ahead? He guesses a lot and gets lucky." Cassian's eyes warmed. "How does he manage project development?" It must be chaotic. He made it sound like professional curiosity, a peer-to-peer admiration that cost nothing. Nora, lulled by wine and the dizzying feeling of being listened to, laughed. Chaotic is a kind word. Victor doesn't trust his own shadow. He sure as hell doesn't trust IT. Really? Cassian leaned forward just slightly. Tell me. He keeps his most sensitive projects completely off-network, she said, the thrill of saying something that felt clandestine brightening her tongue. Air-gapped, private data center. Only him and 2 engineers have access. He calls it Project Helios. She did not name the location. She did not say the engineers' names, though they rested on her tongue. It was gossip, nothing a person couldn't infer if they spent enough time in Victor's orbit. But when she said Project Helios, she saw it, so quick she could have missed it. Cassian's eyes sharpened with a brief, triumphant light, a predator glimpsing the underbelly of something large. He masked it almost instantly with a smooth smile, but it had flickered, and her stomach turned cold. Don't be paranoid, she told herself. After all, she didn't work for Victor anymore. Her loyalty, layered and fragile, belonged to Cassian now. That's fascinating, Cassian said, taking an easy sip of wine, his face once again unreadable. You're very observant, Nora. It's a rare skill. He meant it as a balm. She took it like a warning that didn't know what it was warning her about yet. The next morning, Nora found 2 sleek black boxes lined up on the kitchen island, like the beginning of a magic trick. Inside, a top-of-the-line laptop and smartphone emblazoned with the minimalist V of Veil Tech. Veil Dynamics Tech Division. A welcome gift, Cassian said, already in a suit that fit him like a second skin. To help you get settled and to make our communication more seamless. Nora smiled politely, because that was the correct move, and she felt that sinking familiar sensation of an unseen price tag. In her world, nothing expensive came without strings. These weren't gifts, they were tools, his tools. She accepted them, her brain already building a plan inside itself on how to stay a half step out of the net, the way swimmers avoid riptides. If he was going to monitor her, and he would, she would have to be smarter than the trap. She would have to be the current under the current. Days fell into a strange rhythm that made it hard to sleep. Cassian was a master at the long game, questions stitched into dinners as if he were picking threads, instead of tugging at them. He never asked too much at once, and Nora, learning quickly, never answered with more than a fragment. It became a dance, a dangerous, exhilarating one. Step and counterstep, question and deflection. She'd never felt so alive or so tired. The lines of their contract blurred at the edges, like ink on wet paper. He took her to a private gallery showing in the Arts Quarter, where an artist had painted the inside of grief. They argued gently about color and form, while champagne hummed under their skin. Abstract expressionism is just permission to lie about your feelings, Nora teased. Says the woman who could build a cathedral out of schedules, he returned, amused and impressed. He discovered her love for old black and white films when a rainstorm stitched itself over Harborview like a shawl. In his private theater, with seats softer than sin, they watched Hitchcock and argued over whether villains were born or made. Cassian surprised her by preferring endings where killers get caught by their own vanity. He was learning her, she was learning him. The man behind the headlines who had a dry wit and a brain that snapped too. He had opinions about art and a habit of tapping his thumb once against the table before he made a difficult decision. He had a small scar near his hairline she only noticed when he laughed at something she said and leaned back into the light just right. She was supposed to be pretending to love him. The pretending began to feel less like a costume and more like skin. The test came at a press event for a new Veil Dynamics subsidiary opening down by the waterfront. Cameras flashed so furiously, the air felt electric. Reporters barked questions that smelled like hunger. "We should dance," Cassian said quietly, his hand finding hers. Not asking exactly, but not forcing. The press will love it. He pulled her into an embrace that lit her nerves up like city lights flickering on at dusk. Up close, she could see the tiniest flecks of silver in his dark eyes, smell that clean cologne. and something warmer underneath that was just him. The laughter and the questions and the jostle fell away until there was only space and music and the steady shape of his hand. "You're playing a dangerous game, Mr. Vale," she whispered into his collar, a warning and a test wrapped together. "The question is, Ms. Hale," he murmured, his voice made of smoke and velvet, "who's winning?" Before she could answer, he spun her and dipped her low, the kind of move meant to be photographed. Flashes strobed, their faces rose close, theirs and no one else's. And then he kissed her. It was supposed to be for the cameras. It was supposed to be a press move. But the second his mouth met hers, pretense evaporated. The kiss was not polite. It was hungry and certain, and so real it rattled her bones. It said all the unsaid things they were both circling. It acknowledged the weeks of tension, the grudging admiration, the growing ache that neither of them wanted to look at straight on. When he lifted his head, his eyes were darker than she had ever seen them, and she couldn't read the language in them. Both of them were breathing too fast. The masks they wore for the world were cracked down the center. Everything shifted on its axis. And what happens after an earthquake? People steady themselves. They pretend the ground is trustworthy. They avoid standing under things that could fall. That week, they were careful. The easy banter was replaced with pauses. They occupied rooms together like colleagues in a glass-walled office, polite, efficient. No lingering glances, no casual touches beyond what the cameras demanded. Cassian threw himself back into work, like a man who didn't know how not to drown, becoming once again that polished, remote CEO whose smile never meant more than it had to. But Nora watched him, and she caught him watching her in the reflection of a window he pretended to study, a mixture of frustration and something he didn't have a word for yet on his face. The breaking point blitzed her, wearing something as banal as a head cold. She woke shaky, aching in a way that felt expensive. She tried to be the person who could power through, took a shower that shivered off her skin, put on a blouse that clung to her damp spine. By mid-morning, the room was tilting and giving up. She collapsed back onto the bed, burning and cold all at once. She braced for a call, an irritated Cassian demanding to know where she was, why she wasn't by his side when he needed her. Instead, there was a gentle knock at her door. "Nora?" "I'm fine," she croaked, the lie as flimsy as tissue. "Just a little under the weather. I'll be up in a bit." The door opened anyway. Cassian stood there with a tray. Water, medicine, a bowl of broth steaming like a promise. He was still in a suit, though the tie was undone and the top button open, as if he'd peeled himself down to something human. "You're not fine," he said, assessing her with a care that felt like it belonged to another man entirely. "You're feverish." He crossed the room without asking, set the tray down, and slid into command. Not the cold corporate kind, but something gentle that wore command's bones. "Sit up," he told her. "Pillows." He propped her, the heel of his hand uncommonly careful at her shoulder. He handed her the pills, then waited, then gave her water and watched her swallow like the act mattered. "Now eat," he said softer. "You need strength." Nora didn't have it in her to argue. She spooned the broth slowly, while he moved around her room like a storm, trying not to tip any picture frames. He pulled the curtains to soften the light. He adjusted the thermostat. He found a cool washcloth in the bathroom and folded it just so across her forehead. He tugged the blanket up over her shoulders, as if he'd been taught once by someone who loved him what comfort could look like. "You should be at work," she mumbled, the guilt rising and tripping over the ache. "I canceled my meetings," he said simply. The words sank into the room without making a ripple. He pulled a chair from her desk and sat there, a quiet sentinel, his posture unreadable, his presence overwhelming and strangely soothing all at once. He woke her gently when it was time for more medication, coaxed water down her throat, murmured something about the way fevers trick you into thinking you aren't thirsty. She drifted, the world assembling and dissolving around his steady outline. Sometime in the evening, she woke to the soft drone of a voice. Cassian was reading out loud from a book she recognized from his library, a leather-bound collection of classic myths. He was telling a story about a woman who fell in love with a monster and discovered that sometimes monsters are just men who were taught to bare their teeth first. His voice was low and even, something a person could sleep inside. Later, the fever broke. The room unblurred. A single lamp cast gold on the floor. Cassian was asleep in the chair, his head tilted back, his face stripped of its calculation. He had fallen asleep holding the book open in his lap, like a parent in a hospital room. It knocked something loose in her, the cold, calcified thing that had edged its way into the space between them. And then he spoke in his sleep. It was a hoarse whisper that made the hair rise on her arms. "Shouldn't feel this way," he said to the dark. "You were just the plan." Nora went rigid. The words struck, precise and unerring, into the softest part of her, the plan, the asset, the pawn. In the most honest cavity of his mind, she was not a person. She was the plan. The dread that seeped into her was colder than any fever. She lay still as stone, eyes open and stinging, listening to the quiet of the room and the louder noise of her own heart cracking. The man who had spent the day caring for her like something fragile and precious was also the man who had orchestrated this entire rearrangement of her life in service of a goal that had nothing to do with her. The word plan echoed in her skull like a drip in a cave. By morning, the fever was gone. In its place, a clarity so sharp it hurt. Every kindness, it blurred at the edges until she could see strategy gleaming underneath like wire. The electric kiss, the nights of listening, the soup and the washcloth. If all of those acts could be both true and calculated, where did the calculation end? She didn't know, but she knew she needed to. Nora put her professional face on, the one that didn't give anything away. She showed up. She moved through the penthouse with quiet ease, efficient and distant. Cassian, relieved that the awkward intimacy of illness had evaporated, reverted to that cool, formal cadence. He was careful with her. She was careful with him. Only now she had turned her most honed skill outward, observation, and directed it at him entirely. She watched the way his eyes lit at the mention of certain supply chains. She noticed how he leaned in when she slipped and mentioned the international partner Victor had courted, a boutique tech manufacturer in Rovaniemi no one remembered anymore. She cataloged his casual questions and lined them up. They weren't random. He wasn't curious. He was building a map of Lang Global's corporate organs, and he was using her as his Google Earth. Nora's laptop, his gift, felt like a spy watching her watch him. She knew the phone was tethered to some management profile. The way it warmed when she pressed a certain sequence told her enough. But Cassian had made a mistake, one powerful man made too often. He had underestimated her. He thought she was a competent assistant. He had never backed up and asked whether competence had a scope he didn't recognize. One evening, Cassian left for a dinner with a venture capitalist who wore his sunglasses indoors and a watch heavy enough to defend himself with. Nora begged off, a lingering headache her alibi. When the apartment settled into its mechanical hum, Nora moved. Her pulse ricocheted and then steadied, her face calm. She walked down the corridor she rarely walked, to Cassian's office, his sanctum, his citadel, with the glass desk and the walls that hid more than they revealed. She tested the handle. It gave. It was so clean, it felt staged. No stray papers, no pens out of place. The desk held a single thing, his desktop computer, a machine heavy enough to be a weapon. The screen woke with a soft, knowing glow. Of course it was password protected. Nora stood still and thought about the man. About the details he let slip when he didn't know he was slipping. About the fact that in the safe embedded in his closet, one she had seen only once when he asked her to retrieve a signed contract, he had typed 4 digits that weren't a date or a name. 1066. The Battle of Hastings. He would choose history. He would choose victory. She typed in a few combinations. Battles, generals, years. The computer denied her, polite and unyielding. She stopped, stepped back, and put her brain into his body. Cassian Vale wasn't sentimental enough for birthdays. He wasn't naive enough for pet names. What did he worship? Not history, not really. He worshipped himself. His name was a brand. His brand was a weapon. She tried a new pattern. Vale Prime. The screen unlocked with a quiet chime. Her heart thudded hard enough to hurt. Her palms went cool. She slid into his private server like a thief who knows she only has a few minutes in the vault. Acquisitions, financials, legal. She bypassed the obvious jewels. She was looking for something that didn't want to be looked at. There. A folder with a name that felt like a whisper you weren't supposed to hear. Operation Nightingale. Nightingales are spies in folklore. They mimic, they tattle songs. Her blood iced. This time she didn't guess the password. She remembered it. One night, after a second bottle of wine and a thunderstorm that had pinned them indoors, Cassian had told her about his first major coup, the hostile acquisition that turned his name into a verb in business schools. He had called it Orion. He liked myth. He liked to cast himself as the hunter. Her fingers were steady now. Orion, 2023. The folder opened. It wasn't a file. It was a dossier. It was her face looking up from a captured photo of her waiting for a bus, hair tucked behind one ear. Nora Hale. It had her work history, her graduation photo. It had more. A report on her father's pension being gutted when Lang Global restructured their subsidiary and shuttered a whole department, including the men like her father who kept the machines running. A detailed record of her mother's medical treatments. Notes on her schedule 2 years ago that made it obvious someone had followed her. It was a blueprint of her life, every seam and stress point highlighted like a flaw a jeweler could exploit. And at the bottom, a document labeled Strategy Memo, written in Cassian's clipped, efficient style. Objective: acquire Lang Global via hostile takeover. Phase 1. Secure access to proprietary data related to Project Helios. Method: identify and leverage key personnel. Target: Nora Hale, Executive Assistant. Hale is competent, undervalued, under financial personal duress. Ideal asset. Execution: engineer public rescue scenario to establish proximity. Establish contract-based personal relationship, e.g. faux engagement, to ensure loyalty and consistent access. Exploit relationship to subtly extract necessary intelligence. Once Project Helios is compromised, initiate takeover. Hale becomes a disposable asset. The word smeared as tears filled her eyes. There it all was, the rescue at the gala, the criteria she met without knowing she was being measured, the contract spelled out coldly, the calculated questions, the tenderness folded into utility. And the worst part, the part that made her hands shake, he had intended to discard her after. She sat frozen in his chair, the blue light of the screen curving her face in a shade of heartbreak. The fairy tale evaporated. The connection she felt shrank under the light until it looked like a trick. The man she had let herself love didn't exist, not in the way she needed him to. The soft chime of the private elevator made the room hold its breath. Nora heard the door. She heard the practiced rhythm of Cassian's footsteps on marble. She didn't move. She didn't wipe her face. She did not close the file. She wanted him to see the wreckage he had orchestrated, organized, monetized. Cassian entered the office with a small smile she had seen 100 times, the one he wore after bending a room. "Nora, I thought you'd be—" He stopped. Something like color left his face. In an instant, he cataloged the scene. Nora in his chair, the glow of his monitor painting her cheeks wet with tears, the open folder, the unhidden language of his betrayal. "Nora," he said, voice strangled, almost breaking. "Don't." Her voice was quiet, almost gentle and utterly empty of warmth. She turned her face toward him slowly, like someone who hears a car coming but won't step out of the road. The devastation in her eyes was whole. He reached a hand out and she flinched before it touched air near her. He lowered it. "It's not what you think," he managed, the old, useless defense tasting rotten in his mouth. "Isn't it?" A bitter, soft laugh broke out before she could stop it. "Identify and leverage key personnel. Ideal asset. Disposable asset. Seems pretty clear to me. Should I draw a flowchart?" That was the beginning, he said, desperate to make words into bandages. "It changed. When I met you, it—" "When?" she demanded, rising, her limbs shaking with anger so pure it stunned her. "Before or after you embedded tracking in my phone? Before or after you asked me about Helios over a romantic dinner? before or after you read to me while I was sick, knowing you were the architect of this entire structure." Each word landed like a knife. He didn't dodge. He couldn't. He had no defense. Everything she said was true. "I fell in love with you," he said. The sentence naked and desperate. "I know what I did. I know how it started. But what I feel is real. Nora, please, believe me." "Believe you?" The floodgates opened and tears ran warm and unstoppable down her face. "How?" "Your world is built on strategy and spin and pressure points. You look at people and see leverage. You move us like pieces. How do I know this isn't just another move? A new strategy to keep your asset compliant now that she's wised up?" Cassian felt something implode in his chest. In constructing the perfect trap, he had bricked himself in. He had made himself impossible to believe. "What we have nothing," she said, the words acting like an exorcism. "We have a contract drafted from a lie. We have a relationship built on deceit. You didn't rescue me. You just built a prettier cage and put flowers in it." She moved toward the desk with the precision of someone sleepwalking. She slid the heavy engagement ring from her finger with trembling hands. It sparkled like a joke. She set it on the desk next to the keyboard that had memorized his worst version. The click of it hitting the wood sounded like a door closing in an empty house. "Our contract is broken," she said, voice hollow. She turned, and the finality in the line of her shoulders almost made him drop to his knees. "Nora, wait," Cassian said, stepping forward, panic unraveling his composure. "Don't go. We can fix it. I will." "There's nothing to fix." Her hand found the door handle. There was never anything real to break. She left, and Cassian, who had never in his life not gotten what he'd aimed at, stood alone in his empire, surrounded by everything he had ever wanted, with the only necessary thing walking away. Hey, dear listener, if this story has you by the throat, make sure you hit subscribe. It helps us grow this little world. Leave a comment and tell me where you think this will go. Now, back to Nora. She did not go back to her apartment in Cedar Ridge. It felt like a museum of her former life, and she didn't have the energy to be a curator. She called the one person who had been steady since sophomore year, the one who had given her ramen when Nora was broke, and a couch when Nora's landlord was a nightmare. Harper let her in without questions, without pity, just space and a blanket, and a corner of a sofa that felt like safe ground. Nora's life condensed to a duffel bag and a toothbrush. For Cassian, the days that followed were a particular circle of hell. The penthouse, which had always been a monument to his control, began to feel like a mausoleum. Everything reminded him of her. The book of myths on the table near her bed, the lipstick she'd left on a napkin, berry-colored proof that she had taken up space here, the echo of her laugh in a kitchen that had mostly known silence. His first instinct was to move, find her, fix it. Deploy the tools that had gotten him everything else: money, influence, presence. He could buy a billboard with an apology 2 blocks from her building. He could surround her with roses until she drowned in them. He could show up at every place she might be, and stand there until she had to look at him. But her words kept looping. "How can I ever believe a single word you say again?" He couldn't outmuscle this. He could only underline her point. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He executed the plan. Operation Helios's breach rolled forward like weather. Using the piece of information Nora had given him, casually, trustingly, he slipped his hand into Victor Lang's supposedly secure system with a precision that would someday be studied in business schools. The takedown of Lang Global was surgical and merciless. Stock prices plummeted, beloved divisions were stripped, acquired, and sold. A week later, Lang Global's board voted to accept Veil Dynamics' acquisition offer. The business world applauded, headlines crowning Cassian again. Genius, visionary, conqueror. But in the conference room where the final signatures were inked, Cassian felt nothing. The victory tasted like ash. In the chair that had held Victor Lang, the leather still warm from someone else's hubris, Cassian realized he had traded the only thing that might have mattered to him in the end for a trophy he didn't want anymore. Meanwhile, Victor Lang was electricity without a ground. Stripped of what defined him, he simmered into bitterness. He could not understand how Cassian had gotten to Project Helios. Then he remembered the gala. He remembered the way Cassian had looked at Nora, his mousy assistant, his little runner. His face morphed into something ugly as the realization bloomed. He hired a private investigator. Finding Nora's new temporary address took less than a day. He waited outside the brick building in the drizzle, wearing a grin that made passers-by choose the other side of the sidewalk. When Nora approached, tucked into a borrowed coat, one hand wrapped around a paper bag with soup, he stepped out of the shadow of the doorway. "Well, well," he drawled, and the poison in his voice stung. "If it isn't the little bird who flew the coop." "What do you want, Victor?" Nora asked, exhausted, not interested in playing his favorite game anymore. "I wanted to congratulate you," he sneered, coming closer in that way of his that invaded without touching. "It was you, wasn't it? You were his weapon. He saw you, pathetic, desperate, useful, and he sharpened you. And you delivered, didn't you? You gave him what he needed to gut me." "Move," she said, quiet but steel, shifting to step past him. "You were the best tool Cassian Vale ever used," Victor hissed, leaning in to make sure the words found the mark. "Take a bow." Nora didn't respond, didn't give him the satisfaction. She pushed past and went inside, but the words, sick and heavy, followed her down the hall, slipping under her skin. It felt like confirmation of the story she was telling herself in the worst hours. Weapon. Tool. Cassian found out about the confrontation before sundown. One of the security details he had quietly assigned to keep space around Nora sent a report, and ice flooded Cassian's veins. A colder, more dangerous fury than he'd ever felt in boardrooms. Victor had lost, and still decided to hurt her if he could. In that moment, Cassian's failure opened up into its full outline. In destroying his rival, he had engineered a wall between himself and Nora, so tall he couldn't climb it even if he wanted to. He had done this. His first impulse was, of course, retaliation. Crush Victor with lawsuits until he couldn't afford a suit to show up to court in. Let power sweep him from the map. But more aggression would only make him look exactly like the monster Nora believed he was. He tried calling her. She didn't answer. He sent flowers. Harper sent them back. He tried sending a piece of jewelry she once admired in a magazine, and the box returned unopened with a note in Harper's sharp handwriting. "Please stop." The tools that had built his world were useless here. Worse than useless. They were insulting. He realized something that made his stomach drop. He had to lay down everything. He had to be unrecognizable to himself. A few days later, a black SUV pulled up on a quiet street in Cedar Ridge, where the Hale bungalow sat under a tired maple tree. Cassian stepped out not in armor, but in simple clothes, a cashmere sweater, dark trousers, no tie. He walked up the path that Nora had painted herself one summer, and he stood in front of the door where the chime played an off-key melody. He could feel his heart beating so hard it pushed against his sternum. Mr. Hale answered the door, recognition and anger and love and fear warring in his face. The man had the kind of hands that told a story of work, grease and wrenches, and holding on even when bolts refused to turn. "What do you want?" Mr. Hale asked. He did not move from the doorway. "To tell you the truth," Cassian said, voice low. "All of it. I just tell you, I don't deserve your time, but I'm asking anyway." Reluctantly, with a look at his wife over his shoulder that said, "Keep your phone near," Mr. Hale let Cassian in. They sat in the living room that smelled like dinner and laundry detergent and decades of family. Framed photographs lined the mantel. Nora's kindergarten grin, high school graduation, a picture of her parents on a beach where the wind made her mother's hair do wild things. It was warm and human in a way Cassian's home had never been. Cassian told them everything. He didn't pretty anything. He didn't shift blame to an overzealous board or an ambitious consultant. He laid the strategy on their coffee table between a dish of peppermint candies and a stack of coasters. He told them how he had seen Nora on a page before he saw her in person, how he had built a plan around her, how he had exploited her goodness, how he had fallen in love with her, even though he tried very hard not to. He told them that he realized love meant choosing to be someone different than who he had been. He told them he didn't expect forgiveness. He told them he loved their daughter unsparingly, and that he would spend whatever time he had left trying to become the kind of man who could be trusted not to break her again. He stood. After he left, Nora's mom Lorraine picked up the phone. She called Nora, who answered on the first ring, worry bolting through her. "Mom, are you all right?" "I'm fine, baby," Lorraine said, voice soft. "But I need you to come home tonight." "Is something wrong?" Nora's throat closed. "No," her mother said, and tears were laced through her voice, hopeful ones. "A very sorry, very foolish, and very much in love man just left our living room. And I think you should hear what he has to say with your own ears." The words hung in Nora's head for 2 days, tugging at her, no matter how she tried to ignore them. Part of her, the part still raw and bleeding, wanted to stay curled up, to build a fort and hang a sign, "No men who lie aloud." Another part, quieter and more insistent, remembered the way Cassian's jaw had clenched when he read to her, the care in the small things. He had gone to her parents, he had used humility, he had done the most un-Cassian thing possible, and maybe that meant something. She agreed to meet him. She chose neutral ground, a public park in the middle of the city where joggers and toddlers and dog walkers created a chorus no one voice could overwhelm. She arrived first and sat on a wooden bench that creaked a little, watching a little boy in a bright yellow jacket careen down a slide with the invincible joy of someone who had not yet learned to be cautious. Cassian came a few minutes later on foot. No security fanned behind him. He wore jeans and a dark coat, and the kind of nervous expression that made him look younger, more human. He saw her and didn't move closer until she looked up and met his eyes. Even then he kept a respectful distance. He wasn't carrying flowers or jewelry. He held a thick leather portfolio in both hands, like an offering. "Thank you for coming," he said, voice low. "My mother can be very persuasive," Nora said. Her tone was careful, not cruel. He nodded, accepting. "I know words are useless from me right now," he began, and she felt something uncoil in her chest at the honesty in that line alone. "So I'm not going to try to talk my way out of this. I'm here to show you." He set the portfolio beside her and stepped back. Nora hesitated, then opened it. She expected, what? A non-disclosure agreement? A check to compete with the hurt? Instead, she found a deed. The deed to a newly acquired but now intentionally defunct corporation. Lang Global. Except the name had been changed. The ink was dry, the stamp official. Sullivan Enterprises didn't exist here. It was Hale Enterprises. "What is this?" she asked, the words thin. "It's yours," he said simply. "I don't want it. I never wanted any of it." Her voice sharpened, then broke. "This company is built on 1,000 small betrayals and a handful of very large ones. I want no part of it." "Understood," he said. "But before we dismantle it, I want you to do 2 things. First, I want you to walk into that building, into the office you know too well, and fire Victor Lang yourself. He needs to hear it from the woman he dismissed. It will bruise where he bruised others." "And the second?" she asked, feeling her heart stumble into a strange rhythm. "I want you to use what's left to build a compensation fund. For every employee Victor underpaid, wronged, or maliciously forced out. For every family that had to wring water from stone because of him. And for your father, justice dressed as accounting. I want you to deliver it." She looked up at him. He wasn't trying to buy forgiveness. He was handing her a sword and stepping back, trusting her not to cut him with it. He was placing a billion-dollar acquisition in her hands and asking her to do what she thought right with it. It was an act of atonement. It was also an admission. He couldn't be the man she needed without removing his hands from the levers. "This doesn't erase what you did," Nora said, tears pricking. Not from pain this time, but from the shock of hope's return. "I know," he said, and his voice was thick. "I don't expect it to. But I hope it tells you who I'd like to be from now on." The next day, Nora Hale walked through the glass doors of Lang Global, now Hale Enterprises, wearing a suit that fit like armor and walked like truth. People noticed. They watched her ride the elevator to the top floor with a man they recognized a few steps behind her, silent and deferential. Cassian Vale was not the CEO today. He was her senior advisor. He took his place a step behind and to her right, like someone who understood his role had been redesigned. It wasn't his power that filled the room when they strode through. It was hers. Whispers flew ahead of them down the hall. Assistants stood. A receptionist put a hand over her mouth in shock and then smiled, small and private. Nora didn't look right or left. She headed straight to Victor's office. She didn't knock, she opened the door. Victor looked up from behind a desk that had been the symbol of everything he thought he deserved. His face jerked with surprise, then warped into bluster. "What is the meaning of this?" he snapped. Standing so quickly, his chair rocked. "You can't just..." He saw Cassian and pointed a finger, an old bully's reflex. "And you. Nora walked to the desk and placed a portfolio on the lacquered surface. She slid it toward him. "It's Hale Enterprises now, Victor," she said, voice cool, steady. "This is no longer your office." He stared down at the deed, at the signatures and the seal, and the color drained from his face, replaced by a blotchy purple that climbed to his temples. He glanced wildly between the deed and Cassian, who stood by the door like a guard who had decided not to intervene. "You did this?" Victor spat at him. "No," Nora said, and the toe of her heel clicked once on marble. "You did this to yourself. With your arrogance, with your cruelty, with the way you treated the people who built your empire and the way you chipped away at anyone who questioned you." She met his eyes and held his gaze without blinking, savoring this moment, not for petty revenge, but for balance, for justice that felt like a steady weight in her palms. "Victor Lang, your employment with this company is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building." A silence followed that sentence that sounded like an exhale. Victor gaped, sputtered. He wasn't used to being talked to in past tense. He made one last pathetic stab at wounding. "He'll tire of you," he snarled, jerking a thumb at Cassian. "Men like him always do." Nora smiled, small, sharp, controlled. "The difference, Victor, is that I never needed him. He seems to think he needs me." Security did their job. The office, once a place where she'd been criticized for the way she stood too close to the printer, became quiet as the door closed on Victor. Nora sank into the leather chair that had loomed over her for years. It felt different under her, not bigger, not smaller, just correct. Cassian approached the desk and leaned against it, looking at her not like a man beholding something he owned, but like a man looking at the sun and understanding he was a planet, not the other way around. "How does it feel?" he asked, voice soft. "Like justice," she said, a smile tipping her mouth. He smiled back, the warmth reaching his eyes for the first time in days. For a moment, the war that had defined them went quiet, and a new word filled the air: after. "So," Cassian said, voice low and cautious, "what do we do now?" Nora leaned back, the leather cool against her back. She looked at him, the man who had planned her life like a campaign map, and then placed the map in her hands and stepped back. The victory over Victor was sweet, but it wasn't a future, not by itself. "Now we talk," she said. Her gaze didn't waver. "No games, no strategies, just you and me in a room telling the truth." He pulled a chair up, not the big one behind the desk that screamed posture, but one of the visitors' chairs that whispered conversation. For the first time since this began, they were on level ground. "I'm listening," he said. She told him everything. Not with the rage that had scorched them both in his office days ago, but with naked honesty that required the kind of bravery she hadn't known she had until she needed it. She told him about the humiliation at the gala that had slid under her skin. She told him about the way he had made her feel possible for the first time in years. She told him about the dread that sat in her stomach every time he asked her something about Lang Global that he shouldn't have needed to know. She told him about the moment with his computer, how her heart had broken like something more physical than hearts are supposed to be. "You didn't just lie to me," she said, voice thick. "You made me doubt my own judgment. You made the most real connection of my life feel like proof of my naivety." Cassian didn't defend. He didn't excuse. He took each word like a blow and stayed present. He let the silence afterwards settle, heavy and honest. "You're right," he said finally, Everything you've said is true. There is no excuse. I was arrogant. I was a coward." He exhaled, and his confession came out in pieces he had never said out loud, even to himself. "I grew up believing people were games, that they would either win at you or you would win at them. It's how I survived my father's house. It's how I built Veil Dynamics. Control was a god. And then you walked into a room and weren't impressed. You made me laugh at myself. You were not afraid of my power. That terrified me. The plan was a shield. If you were just the plan, I didn't have to feel everything I felt." He leaned forward, eyes not pleading as much as confessing to a judge he respected. "But it was a lie I told myself. The truth is, I lost control the second I held your hand at that stupid, beautiful gala. I love you, Nora. I know the beginning of our story is unforgivable, but my feelings are the most real thing I own." "Please," he whispered, "give me a chance to prove it, a real one." She looked at the man in front of her, the version of him made of honesty instead of strategy. The anger that had once filled her like lightning had dissipated, replaced by an ache edged with something she dared to call hope, because she was trying to be someone who didn't run from that word. She had asked for honesty. He had brought her a lifetime's worth. "One chance," she said, voice clear enough to hold, "on my terms." Relief flared so bright across his face it was almost painful to witness. "Anything." "Our new contract," she said, a small fierce smile playing at her mouth. "No clauses, no fine print, one rule." "What is it?" "Total honesty," she said. "Always, no matter how ugly. No secrets, no games." He stood, rounded the desk, and knelt in front of her without hesitation. He took her hands, and his eyes shone. "I accept," he said, voice thick. "No games." She leaned forward, and he met her halfway, and the kiss they shared wasn't fireworks or press fodder. It was soft and reverent, the kind of kiss that recognizes that love is something you show up for, day after day, not something you perform. It sealed a new deal, not in ink, but in breath and intent. 1 year later, the headquarters that had once been Lang Global didn't look like power had to. The dark furniture had been replaced with air and light, open floor plans, and art from local creators. The corners that hid harsh conversations now held coffee and collaboration. The plaque on the wall read, "The Hale Foundation." Nora sat at the head of a long table, leading a board meeting with a calm command that made people sit straighter, not out of fear but respect. The foundation provided legal aid and financial assistance to people wronged by corporations that had been very good at making grievances sound like misunderstandings. They took on cases that made other nonprofits flinch. They won. Cassian sat at the other end of the table, not as a patron saint or a puppeteer, but as an equal. A board member who brought his brain and left his ego. He watched Nora navigate a heated discussion about their next initiative with a smile that could only be described as reverent. He had put a broken kingdom in her hands, and she had built a place where ordinary people could walk through the doors and feel the balance tilt, finally, a little, back in their favor. That evening, they stood on a terrace that had warmed because Nora had filled their home with things that had nothing to do with market cap. Potted plants softened edges. A shelf that once held art books now held novels dog-eared and loved. A stray cat had once wandered up shivering on a stormy night. He now roamed their rooms like he owned them, wearing a collar with a tag that said Mercury, because Nora liked the way the planet and the messenger both sounded in her mouth. The penthouse no longer floated above the city like a fortress. It was a home. "You were brilliant today," Cassian murmured into her hair. His arms wrapped around her waist while they watched Harborview glitter. "You scare me a little, in the best way." "I had a good advisor," Nora said, leaning back into him. They stood like that for a long time, the silence thick with the kind that nourishes. "I'm glad my plan went so wrong," he said eventually, kissing the crown of her head. Nora turned in his arms to look at him, and the playful smile he loved sparked in her eyes. She reached up and straightened his tie, a motion that once had been part of her job, and now was a ritual she liked because it reminded her of both the past and the present in equal measure. "It was the best deal you ever made," she said. He smiled, his real smile, the one that still made her heart skip just because it had survived everything. He kissed her, not like men kiss when they want to stake a claim, but like men kiss when they know the claim is mutual. There were no boards to convince, no cameras to fool. There was only the two of them and the life they were building brick by honest brick. They were no longer pieces on a board. They were partners in a life designed not for spectacle, but for staying. Our story pauses here, but there are more waiting for you. If this one stirred something, hit subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell me which moment made you hold your breath. We'll meet again very soon for another love story reckless enough to feel real. Thank you for listening.